Story 1. It was October 1st, the fresh autumn breeze filled the air, and fall, my favorite season, was in full swing. My boyfriend Carter and I were experiencing our first fall living together in our new home. I decided to surprise him by decorating the place with fall and Halloween-themed decorations while he was at work. After purchasing a few items from nearby stores, I searched Facebook Marketplace for additional fall decorations. One listing caught my eye: a large green plastic container filled with various fall-themed items for only $20. It was a steal. The description read, "Everything must go." Intrigued, I clicked on the seller's profile. His name was Cody, and his profile seemed low-key, with a blurry lake photo as his cover picture and his face obscured by a trucker hat in the profile picture. I messaged him to ask about the decorations, and he replied instantly, confirming they included tableware, outdoor decorations, and more. Cody said he'd be available at 9 p.m. and provided an address. The location wasn't in the best area, but the house looked normal enough in the Google Street View image. To be safe, I asked my friend Sally to accompany me. We arrived at Cody's address around 9 p.m., noticing dim lights in the house but no cars in the driveway. I messaged Cody to say we were there, and he responded, "I'm at the door, you can come in." However, when Sally and I approached the house, we saw the blinds shift slightly, as if someone were watching us. Feeling uneasy, I called out Cody's name from a distance, but there was no response. Just as we were about to leave, a man partially peered out from behind the door and motioned for us to come in. Hesitant, we stepped inside, leaving the front door open. The house reeked of an odd combination of old cotton and something foul. Cody's voice boomed from another room. "It's over here, come." His deep, intimidating voice made us cautious. When we entered the living room, we were greeted by a depressing, dimly lit space with a red carpet and old furniture. A different container than the one in the photo sat in the middle of the room. The smell in this room was putrid, like death. Cody gestured to the container, but when I asked him to open it, he replied, "Well, you're no fun." At this point, Sally and I started inching toward the door. Cody lifted the lid, releasing an even more nauseating stench. Without waiting to see what was inside, we bolted out of the house and drove away. Later, Carter convinced me to give him the address so he could look up the house. When he visited the next day, an older woman answered the door, claiming she lived there alone. We were left with no explanation for what had happened, but I've since sworn off buying anything that requires going to someone's house. Story 2. In 2019, I lived alone in Asheville, North Carolina for a temporary job. Being new to the area, I took advantage of the nearby hiking trails. One October day, I decided to explore DuPont State Forest, a peaceful escape about an hour's drive away. The cloudy weather and recent rainfall promised spectacular waterfalls. I began my hike mid-morning, eager to see the famous Triple Falls. The trail was serene, and I appeared to have it all to myself. After reaching the falls, I sat on a rock to enjoy the view and snap some photos. That's when I noticed a woman on the trail staring at me. She had short grayish blonde hair and looked to be in her mid-50s. I waved, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked back into the woods. Shrugging it off, I continued hiking to High Falls, a higher point on the trail. When I paused for more photos, I saw the woman again, watching me from the woods. Feeling uneasy, I avoided eye contact and continued hiking. By the time I reached the covered bridge, she appeared once more. This time I decided to confront her, but as I approached, she turned and walked away at an unsettlingly fast pace. She disappeared before I could follow. On my way back down the trail, I asked a fellow hiker if she'd seen the woman. She hadn't, but we shared a laugh about the strangeness of the situation. I returned to my car without further incidents, chalking it up to a quirky encounter. That evening, I shared the story with a date, finding humor in the odd experience. Later that night, I woke up abruptly in my dark apartment, which was unusual for me as a heavy sleeper. At the foot of my bed stood a woman. I froze in terror, recognizing her as the same woman from the trail. She stared at me, then silently turned and walked out of the room. My screams echoed through the apartment as I scrambled to turn on the lights. Knife in hand, I searched the entire space but found no one. Shaken, I called my father, who suggested I might have hallucinated due to being half asleep. While his explanation made sense, the vividness of the figure and its resemblance to the woman in the woods left me deeply disturbed. That night, I barricaded my bedroom door, hoping never to encounter her again. Story 3. It was 2019 when this happened. I remember it clearly because it was the year I was living on my own in Asheville, North Carolina. I had moved there for a temporary job and was excited to live on my own for the first time. At 22 years old and fresh out of college, I had an apartment downtown. I could walk to most places I needed, but I also had my car for trips outside of town. One of my favorite things about North Carolina was the abundance of hiking trails. I had explored many around town, but I had yet to visit DuPont State Forest. One Wednesday in October, I decided to make the trip. It was just under an hour's drive from Asheville. The leaves were starting to change, and it was the perfect time for a hike. That day, being a weekday, meant the trails were mostly empty. The recent rains made me excited, knowing the waterfalls would be even more impressive. After arriving at the parking area, I started hiking. The trail was peaceful, and I felt like I had the entire place to myself. After about 4 miles, I reached the Triple Falls, an impressive sight. I took some pictures and videos while sitting on a rock to take it all in. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed a woman on the trail staring at me. She stood at a distance, so I waved to be polite. She didn't wave back. Instead, she turned around and walked deeper into the woods. Shrugging it off, I continued my hike, ascending the trail to the high falls. Once there, I took more photos and rested again. That's when I noticed her again. The same woman was standing in the woods, watching me. This time I didn't wave. I looked down at my phone, pretending not to notice, but when I glanced back up, she was gone. I began to feel uneasy. The woman looked to be around 55 with short, grayish blonde hair, but she was far enough away that I couldn't make out many details. I didn't see where she went, but I decided to keep going and hope not to cross paths with her again. Eventually, I reached another trail landmark, the covered bridge. I stopped for another round of photos and a water break. When I glanced back at the side of the bridge I'd just come from, there she was. She stood at the end of the bridge, staring at me again. I hadn't heard her approach, and the sight of her standing there unsettled me deeply. This time I decided to confront her. I started walking toward her, calling out, "Excuse me," but she quickly turned and walked away. What disturbed me most was the speed at which she moved unnervingly fast for someone her age. I leaned against the edge of the bridge, trying to calm down. After a few moments, I decided to head back. On my way down the trail, I passed a younger woman walking her dog and decided to ask her if she'd seen the older woman. She said no. We shared a laugh about how strange it was, and I continued on my way, determined to reach my car as quickly as possible. The rest of the trail was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling that she might reappear. Thankfully she didn't, and I made it back to my car. That evening I went out with a girl I'd been seeing. Over pumpkin spice beers at our favorite local bar, I told her about the strange woman on the trail. She found it amusing and we laughed about it, brushing it off as just a weird coincidence. Later that night I went home and fell asleep. I'm a heavy sleeper, so waking up in the middle of the night is unusual for me. But that night I did. Still groggy, I became aware of a figure at the foot of my bed. It was her. The same woman from the trail stood at the foot of my bed, her silhouette visible in the dim light of the room. My blood ran cold, and I started screaming, pressing myself against the headboard in terror. She didn't move at first, just stood there staring at me. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out of the room. Shaking and gasping for breath, I turned on my bedside lamp. The room was empty. I grabbed the knife I kept in my nightstand and checked every corner of my apartment, turning on every light as I went. There was no one there, no sign of forced entry, no open windows or doors. I called my dad, desperate to tell someone what had happened. After explaining everything, he groggily reassured me that it must have been a hallucination, a lingering image from earlier that day, conjured up by my half-asleep mind. Deep down, I knew he was probably right, but the sight of her had felt so real, and what truly terrified me was how much the figure resembled the woman from the trail. That night, I barricaded my bedroom door with my dresser. I never saw her again, but I've never been able to forget her.